Police harass an elderly woman. Chuck steps in without a word. Chapter 1. The quiet strength of Miss Evelyn. There's a kind of silence only small towns know. Not the absence of sound, but the stillness that comes with time. That was the kind of quiet that settled over the town of Dry Creek, nestled between faded fields, rusting pickup trucks, and a horizon that never changed. The town had one gas station, one diner, a sheriff's department with 3 officers, and a population just small enough for everyone to know each other's secrets, but polite enough not to say them out loud. At the heart of it all was Miss Evelyn Carter. 83 years old, white hair always tied in a neat bun, glasses thick as jar bottoms, wore long skirts, knitted cardigans, and always had a purse that looked like it had seen 3 wars and still won. She walked slowly, but not weakly, every step placed with intention, every breath calm. People in Dry Creek called her Miss Evelyn, never just Evelyn. Even the teenagers, even the mayor. Not because she demanded respect, but because something about her commanded it. She lived in a small house with creaky floorboards and ivy that wrapped around the porch like it had known her since childhood. And maybe it had. Evelyn Carter had been in Dry Creek longer than most of its buildings. She ran the town's only bookshop, if you could call it that, Carter's Corner, a dusty little place with more stories than customers. Some days, no one came in at all. But Evelyn would still unlock the door every morning at 9 a.m., sweep the sidewalk, and turn the open sign like she was preparing for a crowd that never came. That was Evelyn. She didn't run the town, but in some ways she was the town. The church ladies said she used to be a teacher. The sheriff said she used to be a journalist. The kids at school whispered she was a retired spy who once saved a president. No one really knew the whole story, and Evelyn never offered it. But everyone agreed on one thing. She didn't need much. She didn't ask for help. And she never, ever caused trouble. Until trouble came looking for her. It started slow, like drop beneath paint. The new deputy, Tom Greeley, arrived 6 months ago. Young, clean-shaven, big on rules, bigger on authority. The kind of man who wore his badge like a weapon instead of a responsibility. He wasn't born in Dry Creek. Didn't understand its rhythm, its people, and he didn't like being questioned, especially not by an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. It began with a parking ticket, a fine slapped on Evelyn's old Ford truck, which had been parked in the same spot in front of her shop for over 30 years. New zoning enforcement, Deputy Greeley said with a smirk, tapping the paper against the windshield like it owed him something. Evelyn had walked outside slowly, quietly. She didn't raise her voice. Son, she'd said, this space is for loading and unloading. Always has been. Not anymore, Greeley replied. Town updated the ordinance. Funny, she said. I read every town meeting agenda. That one never came up. He didn't like that. He didn't like the way she looked at him. Not angry, but unimpressed. Like he was a student giving the wrong answer too confidently. And from that day on, the game began. More tickets followed. Then noise complaints, absurd ones. Accusations that her bookstore stayed open too late. Reports that she had unauthorized gatherings, which turned out to be knitting circles and book clubs made up of old women who brought their own tea. People began to notice. At first, they thought it was just a misunderstanding, then a coincidence. But it kept happening, and Evelyn never stopped standing up for herself. Not with anger, not with threats, just presence. And that presence infuriated Deputy Greeley. On a windy Thursday afternoon, it escalated again. Evelyn had walked across the street to the post office, holding a bundle of stamped letters tight against her chest. The wind blew one loose, and she chased it down with short, determined steps. She didn't notice the cruiser parked slightly too close to the crosswalk. But Greeley did. He got out, sunglasses on, badge glinting, boots too loud on the pavement. Miss Carter, he barked. You just jaywalked. She looked up at him, steady. I stepped into the road, not across it. You obstructed traffic. There is no traffic, she said, gesturing at the empty street. This is Dry Creek, not Manhattan. He pulled out his ticket pad. She didn't flinch, just sighed. Tom, there are better ways to earn respect than writing paper. That did it. He stepped too close. Close enough that his shadow covered hers. You think you're above the law? He said, voice sharp. No, she replied softly. I just think you don't understand what it's for. Across the street, leaning against the wall of the diner, stood a man no one had noticed. Denim jacket, boots scuffed by miles of road, weathered face, still as stone. A cowboy hat sat low over his eyes, arms crossed over his chest. He'd been there for a coffee, nothing more. But his eyes never left the scene unfolding in front of the post office. Chuck Norris didn't speak. He didn't move. But he watched, and that alone was enough to change the air. Inside the diner, Old Man Willis sipped his soup and nudged the waitress. That fella outside, he whispered. Ain't he? The waitress squinted through the window. Don't know, she said, but he looks like the kind of man you don't ask twice. Outside, Deputy Greeley was still writing, still barking, still trying to prove something. Evelyn stood with her shoulders straight, with her dignity. But even dignity had its limits. And everyone in town, even those pretending not to look, felt something unspoken ripple through the air. Something was coming. They just didn't know who. Chapter 2. When Respect Dies. That Thursday afternoon should have ended like any other in Dry Creek. Quiet, dusty, and forgettable. But it didn't. By 3:42 p.m., the street outside the post office wasn't just occupied. It was watching. Evelyn stood tall, her spine straight despite her age, arms folded neatly across her chest, as Deputy Tom Greeley waved his citation book around like a sword. The ticket flapped in the wind, but his ego was still firmly planted. You'll sign this, he said, tone clipped, or I'll escalate it. You can do what you feel you need to do, Evelyn replied evenly. But I won't sign a lie. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her voice was like a page from an old book, soft, yes, but every word carried the weight of 1,000 stories. Greeley's hand tightened around the pen. Ma'am, if you don't comply. Ma'am, she interrupted, is what you say when you're about to do something wrong and want it to sound polite. Gasps escaped from across the street. People peeking through diner blinds. A clerk locking up the hardware store paused mid-turn. Evelyn had just called out the badge, calmly, directly, in front of the whole town. And Deputy Greeley was not a man who tolerated being questioned in public. He stepped closer, way too close. Evelyn didn't step back, but she did blink, slowly, the kind of blink that says, I see you, and I'm not impressed. Chuck Norris still hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the diner, hands resting lightly on his belt buckle, head tilted just enough to see. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, just observed. But if anyone had dared to look closely, they'd see it. The stillness in him was shifting, like calm water before a sudden current. Back across the street, Greeley's voice cracked louder. You're obstructing justice, he snapped. I'm obstructing nothing, Evelyn answered. You're just not used to being told no. I'm giving you one more chance, Miss Carter. To do what? She asked, eyes narrowed. Embarrass yourself further? That was it. The switch flipped. He grabbed her wrist. It wasn't violent. Not quite. But it was firm. Too firm for an elderly woman. Too public for decency. And far too unnecessary for a woman whose only crime was standing up. She winced, not from pain, but from the weight of a town watching her dignity get manhandled. And still, no one moved. Not the clerk. Not the waitress. Not the mayor's cousin, who was watching from inside his parked car. The crowd was growing, but the courage wasn't, until a single sound cut through the moment. Boots. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from across the street. One pair. No backup. No badge. Just presence. Chuck Norris stepped off the curb. He didn't say a word. Didn't call out. Didn't make a show. He just walked. And with every step, the air thickened. Deputy Greeley didn't notice at first. His back was still turned. But Evelyn saw. Her eyes flicked up. She didn't gasp. She didn't smile. She just relaxed, like a house realizing the foundation hadn't cracked after all. Greeley was still ranting when Chuck reached the sidewalk. You want to play tough, ma'am? He barked. You think age makes you untouchable? Chuck stopped, a few feet away, close enough to be seen, close enough to be felt. Greeley turned and finally noticed. The yelling stopped, and the silence roared louder than anything that had come before it. Chuck didn't speak, didn't blink, Didn't even look angry. But his eyes, oh, those eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't loud. They were still, like a storm before the lightning. Greeley squinted. Who the hell are you? Chuck tilted his head slightly. Didn't answer. Didn't need to. The crowd, once hidden in doorways and behind blinds, was now fully exposed, watching, waiting. You think you can intimidate me? Greeley challenged. This is official business. She resisted a citation and threatened an officer. Evelyn scoffed softly. I threatened his pride. Chuck's eyes shifted to her, softening just for a breath. A gesture no one expected from a man built like silence made flesh. Then he turned back to Greeley and took one step forward. Greeley put his hand on his belt. Not his weapon, but close enough to remind everyone it was there. And that's when something ancient settled in the air. A tension older than this town, older than right and wrong. The tension of a line being drawn. And every person watching knew which side of it Chuck stood on. Greeley looked around now, realizing no one was moving to support him. No backup, no cheers, only eyes, watching him, judging him, and one man standing in front of him. Quiet, ready, unimpressed. You think you can stop me? Greeley asked, voice cracking slightly now. Chuck looked down, at the hand still wrapped around Evelyn's wrist, then back up, and just looked at him. And Greeley let go. He didn't say why, didn't apologize. He just backed up. 2 steps, 3. The space between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. Chuck stepped forward again. One more time, just enough to make the line clear. You don't touch people like her. Not while he's breathing. Not in this town. Not anywhere. Greeley stammered, trying to find words. I'll be reporting this, he muttered. Interference, obstruction. Chuck said nothing, but the deputy was already retreating, fumbling for pride that no longer existed. He crossed the street, got in his cruiser, and drove away. Fast. The dust from his tires settled slowly, but the silence Chuck left in his wake settled harder. He turned to Evelyn, offered her his arm. She took it, not because she needed it, but because he offered, and that was that. They walked across the street together, slow, unbothered. The crowd parted like water. Still no words. None needed, because sometimes silence is the loudest kind of justice. Chapter 3. The town wakes up. The next morning, the town of Dry Creek didn't rise with its usual sluggish breath. It buzzed, not loudly, not like cities do, but with the soft, electric hum of a secret everyone suddenly knew. Evelyn Carter had stood her ground. Deputy Tom Greeley had backed down, and a man with no badge, no words, and no warning had made it happen. By 8:15 a.m., the diner was full, not with orders, but with murmurs. Did you see him? Just walked up like a ghost. He didn't even say a word, just stared, and Greeley folded, like a lawn chair. Across the counter, the waitress just nodded. She'd seen him too. Chuck Norris, or someone who walked like legend and silence were the same thing. No one really knew him, but they knew what he was. And somehow, that mattered more. At the sheriff's office, things were tense. Greeley was late. Unusual for a man who showed up 30 minutes early every day to shine his boots and check his reflection in the glass. When he finally arrived, he slammed the door so hard the sheriff's coffee jumped in its cup. You okay? Asked Sheriff Don McClellan, a man whose tired eyes had seen enough to know when the wrong kind of pride was limping in. Greeley paced. He walked right up, didn't say a word, just looked at me. Who? The guy. The cowboy. McClellan raised an eyebrow. You mean Chuck Norris? You know him? Not personally, the sheriff said, slowly stirring his coffee. But I recognize a man who doesn't waste energy when he can use silence. He obstructed me, Greeley snapped. No, McClellan replied. You embarrassed yourself. He just stood there and reminded you that you were being watched. Greeley didn't respond, because deep down, he knew it was true. By noon, Evelyn's bookshop had more visitors than it had seen in a month. Most came under the pretense of buying a paperback or donating an old box of novels. But really, they just wanted to see her, to stand in the presence of someone who'd endured. She didn't bask in it, didn't gloat. She served tea to 2 school teachers, recommended poetry to a truck driver who didn't know he liked poetry, And when a young girl asked if the man who saved her was really Chuck Norris, she smiled and said, "He didn't save me. He reminded someone I wasn't alone." That was Evelyn. Never the victim, never the show, just there, steady as a mountain, soft as warm paper. Chuck stayed at the edge of town, in a cheap motel by the old highway. Room 6. He didn't unpack much, just laid his boots at the foot of the bed, folded his jacket over the chair, and poured a cup of black coffee from the tin pot on the dresser. No sugar, no milk. He sat by the window and watched the street. Didn't turn the TV on, didn't check his phone, just watched. Some men guard things with locks and alarms. Chuck guarded with stillness. That afternoon, 2 sheriff's cruisers passed the motel, slow. One of them stopped. Greeley. He sat in the car for a moment, just looking at the door to room 6. He didn't get out, didn't dare. He drove on, but the seed was planted. By sunset, fear had changed shape in Dry Creek. The people who used to worry about Evelyn now wondered about the man who stood beside her without a word. Some called him a guardian angel, others a ghost. One teenager swore he was a government agent sent to clean up the corrupt. Someone else started a Facebook post titled, "Chuck Norris is watching." But Chuck didn't watch for fame. He watched for justice. And now, the balance had shifted. That night, Evelyn locked up her shop and walked slowly home. The air was brisk, the sky bruised purple and gold. As she reached her porch, she noticed something tucked under the welcome mat. A note, folded, no envelope, just paper. She unfolded it with thin, steady hands. "He's watching you. You better watch back." No signature, no handwriting she recognized. Just letters, too clean, too sharp. She didn't panic. She didn't even flinch. She just folded the note and placed it in her purse. Then she turned, looked down the road, and saw him, leaning against the fence post across the street. Boots, hat, stillness. Chuck gave his smallest nod and disappeared into the dark. In a town where people used to walk by when trouble stirred. Now they paused, because now they asked themselves one question. What if he's watching? And in that pause, something new began. Accountability, decency, fear, yes, but the right kind. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears boots and says nothing at all. Chapter 4. They thought she was alone. It started just after sundown. The quiet kind of evening in Dry Creek, when porch lights flickered on one by one like fireflies waking up. The scent of fried chicken drifted down Main Street, and country radio played faintly from the gas station speakers. But on the south end of town, near the row of rundown houses and broken fences, something else stirred. 2 cruisers, unmarked, parked in the alley behind Miss Evelyn Carter's home. Their lights were off, engines running low, hidden in plain sight. Inside one of them, Deputy Tom Greeley leaned forward, staring at the small house like it was a battlefield he had to reclaim. "She made us look weak," he said. Beside him sat Officer Jenks, younger, nervously tapping his thumb against the steering wheel. "Sheriff said let it go. Said Chuck Norris is dangerous." "She's an old woman," Greeley growled. "And he's just a man." He didn't say the second part out loud, but I've never seen eyes like that before. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out. "Tonight," he said, "we remind this town who wears the badge." Inside her home, Evelyn was making tea. She moved with the grace of someone who had repeated this ritual 1,000 times. Kettle, cups, honey, silence. She hummed an old gospel tune, soft and low, the kind her mother used to sing during storms. It wasn't about fear. It was about faith. And faith, she knew, only mattered when fear showed up. She didn't hear the back door creak open, didn't hear the 2 sets of boots cross her porch. But she felt it, the kind of presence that makes the air shift, that makes your bones go still before your brain catches up. She turned toward the sound just as the back door opened wider. And there he was, Greeley. No smile this time, no ticket book, just a man with something broken behind his eyes. Behind him stood Jenks, unsure, uncomfortable. "Evening, Miss Carter," Greeley said, stepping into her kitchen without invitation. "You're trespassing," she said calmly. "Town ordinance says officers can inspect any property in pursuit of an investigation." "There's no investigation," she replied. He He stepped closer. There is now. Back at the motel, Chuck sat in the dark. Same room, same boots, same stillness. But something was off. The night didn't feel right. It was too quiet. Even Dry Creek had a rhythm. Dogs barking in the distance, a kid sneaking out a window, the sound of a screen door slamming shut somewhere. But tonight, the silence wasn't rest. It was warning. Chuck stood, slipped on his jacket, and walked outside. In Evelyn's kitchen, the tea had gone cold. Greeley circled slowly, like a wolf pretending to be a man. "You've caused problems," he said. "For me. For the department." "I spoke truth," she replied. "If that causes problems, then the problems were already there." His jaw tightened. Behind him, Jenks shifted his weight. "Maybe you need a reminder," Greeley said, "that we're the law here. Not some old woman. Not some washed-up cowboy with a reputation." Evelyn didn't blink. "Then act like the law," she said. That was it. The last thread. Greeley stepped forward, raising his voice. "Don't talk down to me. You think you're a symbol? You're just old. And people like you only matter until we say you don't." He grabbed her wrist again. Harder this time. Her teacup fell and shattered on the floor. And outside, 2 boots hit the dirt. Chuck had arrived. He didn't rush. Didn't run. Just walked. Down the alley. Past the cruiser. Through the back gate. Right up to the porch where the kitchen window glowed faint yellow. He could hear it now. The yelling. The shaking in her voice. The fear. And beneath all that, his own silence. Growing louder with every step. Inside, Jenks finally spoke. "Tom, this is too far." "Shut up," Greeley snapped. "We're just making sure she understands." He turned toward Evelyn again. "You see what happens when you forget your place." That's when the screen door creaked. Just a little. Just enough. Greeley turned, and Chuck Norris stepped into the kitchen. No words. No expression. Just presence. Jenks backed away immediately. He wasn't stupid. But Greeley was prideful. He stepped forward, one hand drifting to his belt. "You think I'm scared of you?" he said. Chuck didn't answer. Didn't blink. He simply looked at Greeley. The same way a forest looks at a match. Greeley took one more step, and that was one too many. Chuck's hand moved like thunder wrapped in calm. He didn't punch. He redirected. One twist of the wrist, one shift of the balance, and Greeley hit the floor hard enough to knock the air out of the room. Disarmed. Disgraced. Done. Chuck turned to Jenks. Jenks raised his hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Chuck stared at him, and Jenks ran. Just ran. Out the door. Down the steps. Into the darkness. Chuck looked at Evelyn. She was shaking, but only from adrenaline. Not fear. She nodded once. "Thank you," her eyes said. He nodded back, then turned, and walked out, leaving Greeley gasping on the floor, no longer a deputy. Just a man who forgot that power has rules. The news would spread in hours. The town would whisper, but this time, they'd whisper with reverence. Because the storm had come, and it had spoken no words. Only justice. Chapter 5. What Silence Left Behind. By sunrise, Dry Creek had changed. The streets looked the same. The cracked sidewalks, the leaning fences, the peeling paint on Main Street storefronts. But beneath the quiet, something rumbled. Like the town had taken a breath in the night and wasn't sure if it was ready to exhale. Everyone knew, even ones who pretended not to. By 6:47 a.m., 3 separate texts had reached the mayor's office. By 7:15, the diner's coffee mugs clinked quieter than usual. And by 8:30, the whispers weren't whispers anymore. They say he didn't even raise his voice. Dropped Greeley like a sack of cement. Didn't even touch his gun. Didn't need to. Chuck Norris had stepped in. And now, the question on everyone's lips wasn't what happened. It was what happens next. At the sheriff's office, the tension was molasses thick. Greeley hadn't come in. No one asked why. Sheriff McClellan stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes on the road. He didn't need a radio call or a formal complaint. He'd seen enough in this job to know when justice had skipped the paperwork. "Jenks left a note," said Deputy Santos, stepping in quietly. "Let me guess," McClellan muttered. "Apology and a resignation?" "Close. Said he's taking his badge back to his father's farm." McClellan nodded once. Didn't say more. He didn't need to, because the badge didn't protect you anymore. Not when you used it to hurt the wrong kind of person. Not when Chuck was in town. At Carter's Corner, the bookstore was open like always. Evelyn stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hands steady. She never addressed it, didn't hang a sign, didn't tell the story. But something had changed in the way she moved, in the way people looked at her. Not with pity or worry anymore, but with respect. The kind that doesn't come from fear, but from awe. Customers came in just to be near her, to be near the woman who had stood without shaking, who had stared down a badge and walked away taller. A high school senior brought her flowers. A little girl asked if she was the lady Chuck protected, and Evelyn smiled, not wide but deep, a smile that meant everything and gave nothing away. He didn't protect me, she said softly. He reminded me I didn't need permission to be safe. Chuck didn't show up at the diner that morning, didn't show up anywhere, but everyone felt him. He wasn't gone, just watching, somewhere nearby, like the town had earned a guardian but didn't know how to thank him, or if it even should. The mayor called a meeting. Quiet, private, select few invited. It wasn't about press releases or damage control. It was about fear. What if he stays? One council member asked. What if he leaves? Someone else countered. And we go back to the way it was? Neither question had an answer, because Chuck hadn't asked for power. He just used it without asking. And now, every person in that room had to ask themselves, are we afraid of him? Or worse, are we afraid of the silence he left behind? That afternoon, Sheriff McClellan drove out to the motel. Room 6. He knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. He opened the door slowly. It wasn't locked. The room was empty. Clean. Bed made. Window cracked. Coffee mug rinsed and placed upside down on the nightstand. No note. No message. Just gone. Like wind through tall grass. Here, then vanished. McClellan stood for a long time in the doorway, then tipped his hat, as if to a ghost, and walked away. Back in town, kids played without looking over their shoulders. Old men sat on porches with fuller breath in their lungs. And Evelyn, she finally took the night off, locked her shop early, made herself a pot of tea, and sat on her porch in the fading sun, watching the street like it was something sacred. She held the broken teacup from a night before in her lap, didn't glue it back together, didn't throw it away. She just kept it a reminder, not of the fear, but the moment it ended. Chuck didn't speak that night, didn't knock, didn't appear in the shadows. But as the wind stirred the oak trees and the street lamps hummed faintly, Evelyn looked across the road and nodded to no one in particular. And somewhere, on a road out of town or a rooftop above it, Chuck nodded back. He didn't leave because it was over. He left because it had begun. And Dry Creek would never forget what silence had taught them. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. By the third day, Dry Creek was quiet again. But it wasn't the old kind of quiet, the dusty, dismissive hush where people looked away and hoped things would settle down on their own. No, this was a new quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something has shifted beneath your feet. When the people who once ruled by intimidation feel the edge of their own reflection. But not everyone got the message. Not Greeley. He didn't leave town. He didn't apologize. He didn't even lick his wounds in peace. He plotted. Because some men aren't just drunk on power. They're addicted to being feared. And once the fear leaves them, they try to manufacture it again. Any way they can. Greeley had been holed up in his garage since the night Chuck disarmed him. The bruises were gone now, but the shame wasn't. Every time he walked down the street, he felt the stares, not bold but aware. People didn't cross the street anymore when he passed. They just looked right at him, like they were unafraid. And to a man like Greeley, that was the worst kind of pain. So he started talking, started planting rumors. He's not even a real ranger anymore. He doesn't say anything because he's got nothing to say. He's a drifter. He'll leave. He always leaves. And most folks ignored it. But a few, just enough, listened. Men like him. Men who missed the days when strength was measured in fear. One of them was Vince Sutter, a tow truck driver with a record longer than his patience, and a bad-shaped chip on his shoulder. The kind who drank at lunch and bragged about fights he never won. Greeley pulled him aside one evening and pointed down the road. He's still out there, he said, lurking, acting like he owns this place. Vince took a long drag on his cigarette. Maybe it's time we reminded him it's our town. That was the plan. Foolish. Short-sighted. Predictable. But it was their plan. It happened just after dusk. Chuck had returned to the motel. Room 6 still empty, but his boots back by the door. He had no reason to stay. No ties here, no unfinished business. But something told him not to leave yet. So he sat by the window, watching the sun die, slow behind the grain silos. And listening. Always listening. The first sound was a car engine. Too loud, too fast, tires sliding over gravel like a warning shot. The second was shouting. Outside the motel. Men's voices. Aggressive. Unsteady. Chuck rose. Opened the door. Stepped into the golden haze of the evening. 4 of them stood in the lot. Greeley, Vince, and 2 others. None wore uniforms. But they didn't need them. They brought something else. A bat. A crowbar. A tire iron. Greeley stepped forward. No more silence, he said. No more staring like you own this place. Chuck didn't speak. Didn't move. Greeley sneered. What? Nothing to say now? No crowd to impress. Still nothing. Just those eyes. Still. Focused. Certain. Vince grunted. He thinks he's better than us. Greeley raised the crowbar. Then let's see what he's really made of. What happened next didn't take long. Chuck didn't draw a weapon. Didn't run. He walked. 1 step. Then 2. Then, with the precision of a thunderclap, he moved. No wasted energy. No unnecessary strikes. Just truth in motion. A wrist twisted, a bat redirected, knees buckled like broken scaffolding. Vince swung, missed, hit the hood of his own truck. Chuck ducked, pivoted, sent him sprawling with 1 precise palm to the chest. The third man ran. Smart. Chuck didn't chase. He didn't need to. And Greeley? He was the last to fall. Not from a punch. Not from a hold. But from fear. He dropped the crowbar, backed away, hands raised. All right, he shouted. All right, you made your point. Chuck stared. No words. No chase. No anger. Just finality. The kind of finality you don't come back from. Greeley stumbled to his knees. Defeated. The motel manager had watched it all from behind the blinds. Didn't call the police. Didn't need to. Because when Chuck turned, the town knew it was over. Really over. Later that night, Evelyn sat on her porch again. Same chair. Same tea. Same slow breathing. She looked up as headlights passed. The truck slowed. Chuck at the wheel. He didn't stop, but he looked at her, and she nodded once. Thank you, she whispered. Chuck didn't hear it. Didn't need to, because the job was done, not through force, but through presence, through the kind of silence that makes men see themselves and change or run. Dry Creek wouldn't forget the man who said nothing and changed everything. Chapter 7. The Woman, the Silence, and What Stayed Behind. Dry Creek woke slowly the next morning. The sunrise didn't feel heavy this time. It painted the rooftops and fields with a gentler gold, like a warm apology for the storm the night before. But this was not a town broken by what had happened. It was a town reborn. The tension that used to live behind curtains, in corners, in the pauses between footfalls, it was gone. Or maybe not gone. Maybe just lifted. Something had shifted permanently in the space between fear and memory, and the whole town could feel it. The sheriff's office didn't open on time that day. Sheriff McClellan sat in his truck a little longer than usual, sipping his coffee, watching the sunlight break across the windshield. He didn't talk to Greeley, didn't return his calls, didn't ask him to explain, because there was nothing left to explain. That chapter was over. He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a plain envelope. Inside was Greeley's badge. He held it in his hand for a long time, then rolled down the window and let it fall into the dirt. At Carter's Corner, the bookstore opened 5 minutes early. Not because Evelyn was in a rush, just because she was ready. The bell above the door jingled softly as the first customer walked in, a teenage girl who had never been inside before. She didn't ask for a book. She just looked around. So, this is where it happened. Evelyn smiled, kind and small. This is where a lot of things happened, she said. Some of them painful, some of them beautiful, most of them quiet. The girl nodded like she understood. And maybe she did, because silence had become something sacred in Dry Creek. It wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. By noon, a group of volunteers began repainting the town's fence line. No one organized it. No one told them to show up. They just came, Old men with buckets. Mothers with strollers tied off to benches. Kids holding brushes twice their size. The town wasn't fixing its walls. It was rebuilding its soul. They painted over cracks, over old names, over memories that needed letting go. But one spot, one panel of fence they left untouched. A simple, burned-in mark remained. He didn't say a word. Nobody could say for sure who carved it. But nobody painted over it either. Because it wasn't graffiti. It was truth. At the edge of town, just past the ridge, a man sat on a rock watching the sunrise reflect off the old grain silos. Boots dusty, hands steady. Chuck Norris didn't wait for gratitude. Didn't collect trophies. He stayed just long enough to know the story was finished. And then he moved on, like a breath that leaves a room just before someone realizes they needed it. Back at the bookstore, a boy brought Evelyn a hand-drawn card. It was crooked and colorful and spelled her name wrong. But she cried anyway. Happy tears, the kind that had been waiting decades to fall. And when she hugged him, gently, carefully, she didn't let go too quickly. Because Dry Creek wasn't afraid anymore. And neither was she. The mayor called a town meeting. No ceremony, no politics, just a microphone on the courthouse steps. He didn't talk about Greeley, didn't talk about Chuck. He talked about Evelyn. Sometimes, he said, we forget who built this town. Not the ones who make the loudest noise, but the ones who show up day after day, year after year, with integrity, grace, and grit. He paused, then pointed toward her. She reminded us what strength looks like. And Chuck, he looked out at the crowd, reminded us that some justice doesn't ask for permission. The crowd clapped, then stood, and in that moment, not loud, not flashy, Dry Creek remembered itself. Later that evening, Evelyn sat on her porch again. Same chair, same tea, same view of the road stretching off into the horizon. But tonight, she wasn't waiting for anything. She was present, whole. And when the breeze picked up, rustling the wind chimes and pushing a single page from her lap to the porch floor, she didn't chase it. She just watched it flutter away. Because some things were meant to leave. And some stories were meant to end without noise. They say Chuck was seen later that week, 2 towns over, helping a waitress change a tire in the rain. No one asked his name. They didn't have to. The legend didn't need a voice. It had already spoken. Chapter 8. The sound that never left. Weeks passed, then months. Dry Creek didn't forget what happened. It couldn't. Because it wasn't just a moment in time. It was a turning point in who they were. Not because the town had fallen apart, but because it had woken up. And every corner now held the echo of that awakening. The post office repainted its brick siding. The sheriff's department brought in a new deputy, one who greeted people with respect, not authority. The diner stopped serving cold coffee and started smiling again. And across all of it, scattered like stardust, was his silence. Chuck was gone, but the space he left behind, it still hummed. One rainy afternoon, a boy in the 4th grade was walking home from school when he saw a group of older kids picking on a smaller one by the bike rack. The little one cried out. The bigger ones laughed. And for a moment, everyone else, the teachers, the parents, the kids across the street, paused like they always had. But then, the boy stepped forward, didn't shout, didn't fight. He just walked up, stood between them, and stared. Still, unblinking. And slowly, the older kids backed away. One even muttered, "He's doing the Chuck thing," before disappearing into the rain. At Carter's Corner, business never boomed. But it never dwindled either. People came in for books, but they stayed for something else. Peace. Evelyn always had the kettle on, always had time to listen. And when asked about that day, the day the badge met the silence, she never told the full story. Instead, she'd smile gently and say, "Some men change the world with their voice, and some change it by saying absolutely nothing at all." And that was all she'd offer, because the legend didn't belong to her. It belonged to everyone. Some say they saw Chuck in a border town 6 months later. Others swear they passed him on the highway, riding a motorcycle as the sun melted into the hills. Someone even claimed he stopped a robbery at a gas station without ever leaving his truck. But they all said the same thing. He never speaks. He never runs. He just shows up when it matters most and disappears before anyone can say thank you. Back in Dry Creek, just outside Evelyn's shop, a small plaque was quietly installed on the corner of the sidewalk. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a nameplate, hand-etched, unofficial. It read, "In honor of the silence that saved U.S." He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. But we listened anyway. And in that little town, tucked between nowhere and nothing, they learned something priceless. That justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wears worn boots, tilts its head slightly, and says everything without making a sound. The end.